voices. Okay, for tonight's program, we are hosting these two phenomenal women to discuss their work and the intersections in between. Frances McCue is a poet and essayist and founding director of Richard Hugo House in Seattle from 1996 to 2006. In 2011, McCue won the Washington State Book Award for her poetry collection, The Bled, and placed as a finalist for a second book, The Car That Brought You Here Still Runs. Her first poetry collection, The Stenographer's Breakfast, won the Barnard New Women's Poetry Prize. She's in conversation tonight with Cary Moon. Cary is a political activist, urban planner, and engineer who was the recent runner-up in Seattle's 2016 mayoral election. She has provided professional expertise to many Seattle departments, commissions, community groups, and committees, including the Seattle Design Commission, the Department of Transportation, and Seattle Parks and Rec. She has received multiple awards, including the Strangers Political Genius Award in 2007 and the Municipal League Citizen of the Year in 2009. McCue's latest book, which I mentioned earlier, is Timber Curtain and is the subject of tonight's talk. But to set up a little bit of the tone, I'm going to briefly play a preview for a film that Frances is working on about some of the themes in this book, Where the House Was. Is that correct? Where the House Was. And I will cue that up right now so we can get the lights.
Gentrification is a process where some people move into a neighborhood and others are displaced. Usually it's people coming in who are wealthier and they have the resources where they can buy the area that's been made better for them, and the people who were there before can no longer afford to be there.
Development is at a fever pitch at the unprecedented levels of growth and capital building that we're losing a lot of the character of our communities.
This was a situation where the neighborhood came to our support to say, this is a good building, it's well motivated, it should be realized. So that's the story that's most meaningful to me, is that if you have well-intentioned, benevolent owners and developers who are interested in a legacy and doing the right thing for the neighborhood, it will be appreciated.
It's so interesting that Hugo was never there. Hugo was never at Hugo. I never believed that until I was like, oh, we had a better.
So then this new building's gonna come in, and we kind of want to figure out what's the recipe for that magic. Like, how do we re-insist Hugo onto the building?
Right. Well, first of all, you have to build a road.
Gentrification wedge. We believe in the stage where we put poets and tellers of tales we all need to hear, while the city whispered on, planning to suffocate one thing after another. When you are young, you find what's overlooked, and you build there.
I had a lot of formative experiences in that Hugo House building, and seeing those videos of the machinery ripping into it is very intense. And there's one more quick clip to show before welcoming the speakers on stage.
Once, I lived in a building that was named after a poet. He wrote poems about small towns and big rivers, about streams and bars. In the West, few writers then had audiences coast to coast. Actually, I think that the narratives were worn out. The same old stories of conquest, to take over the frontier, while the land belonged to indigenous people. Those stories were worn out. My apartment was above a cafe where poets and writers and actors
Please join me in giving a warm welcome for Frances McCue and Cary Moon.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Wow, this is exciting. It's really weird to hear my voice up there and then here. So, Cary and I thought it might be fun if I started with a couple of poems from Timber Curtain, just to set the stage. For what it was. When my daughter Maddie said, "Look, it's so shiny," and she pulled the crack pipe from the sand, she looked so happy. She held it up for a minute. I let her hold it. Then I took it away. We lived where we should have. We didn't aspire to more. Rain pooled in the swings. Syringes sang in the dirt. Remember that, Seattle? Here's another one. Retracing my steps. In our city, there's all this replace, redo this, remodel that. A game of pick up and put away. Shell, coin, peanut, plastic housing slipped inside old brick. I can't walk to the store without missing bits. Marks, treads, and dust shake out, and underfoot what's left disappears at the thresholds. Wish. Let's reenact, replace, repurpose our old ways. Let's re all the way to the retirement house. Let's tire ourselves again and again, replace this place and that place, this once salty patch of earth smothered under peat or stone, brushed by salmon bones. A teardown lets you let things go, but scrap gives back. Tinkers come and poke. Developers call it a footprint. You pass along with your boots on, a crime scene outline, your life aching in the gone, shimmering. That's our little start to our discussion tonight, Cary.
Thank you, Frances, for reading, for writing that fantastic book, and for
thank you.
reintroducing me to the realm of poetry after spending the last 9 months in politics, which I think is the antithesis of poetry. It was really nice to be back in that space of asking questions and dwelling in the unknowable. So thank you for inspiring that.
Oh, thank you. You know, I think that politics and writing poetry have a lot in common. Want to know how? Yeah. Okay. Here's what I think. I think when you're engaged in a creative process of making something that the world doesn't know it wants, right? Like it's like being kind of a little entrepreneur. Like nobody thinks the world needs another poem. So you're tinkering away, making it. But it really comes to you as a little germ of an idea, and then you have to listen to it and re-articulate it and reform it until it becomes the right thing. So it seems to me like that's how you do politics. Like you listen and follow, and the hunch bears out to be a better idea than if you were driving a train towards it to solve it.
Well, I'll say that's definitely how I was trying to do politics. I'm not sure the system was really set up to accept that, but I kept pushing for that as much as I could.
Yeah, I think you did it beautifully. I
Thank
think
you.
it's so much like living a good life, paying attention and taking an inkling or a hunch or something you know is an injustice and articulating it until you get it right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I have a big, fat, juicy question to start off, the more formal part of this. You ready?
Okay, I hope
Okay.
so.
Are you ready? So personal connection to place is universal, even if the places are not. How did you decide to share your intimate moments of your life in that building? At moments, this book feels like an exploration of your personal emotional standing while in that place, an effort to express, this was me. But it's more than that, isn't it? Were you aiming to connect with the Hugo House community and write a memoir of your time there together? Or were you using your relationship to this one building as a point from which to tap into our city's shared narrative with change, loss, and renewal of hope?
Wow, you're giving me a lot of credit. Let me think about that. So I think this book came because I wanted to make a short archival film about the teardown of Hugo House, and then it turned into a whole big project because it sort of had a lot of energy. A lot of people came towards the idea and were like, yeah, the city's really changing. So I started to write poems that feel, when you put them together, like a little novel. So hopefully this is like a page-turning book. So I think in my quest for writing about character and place, I ended up putting some of my own story in here. And some of my friends say, wow, it's a really personal book about gentrification. But isn't it something we're all taking kind of personally right now? I mean, are your conversations filled with what's the missing things are and the new horror driving around a corner? So I think I did what I just know how to do, I think, which is to try to live into the answers. So for me, this book arrived just by sitting with the loss of the city being erased. And then, this is where I think it turned for me. Because I'm a poet, I want novelty. Like, I will sacrifice the truth for novelty. I will change and distort things so that the music sings as I'm writing. Does that make sense? This is like a Richard Hugo premise, like, let the truth conform to music. So as the idea started to get momentum, I realized I needed to kind of live into the narrative or live into the answers. So the book ends up being kind of a mashup, I think, of thinking about the larger issues of a disappearing city at the same time bearing personal witness to it. And there are a lot of hazards about doing that. So I don't know, what do you think? Does that answer it?
Yes, that answers it. And I think we're watching this transformation, this flux happen so quickly. And I think whether you're sort of pro-growth and pro-new development and okay with shiny and new, like I am, or you're resisting and you want things to be like they used to be, I think we're all perplexed and we're all flummoxed. Like, how is this happening? And who's in charge? And how do these decisions get made? And why am I not at the table? And what is the dynamic that's creating this? Because it's like nothing we've ever experienced before. I don't think, maybe if you lived in Shanghai for the last 10 years, maybe you saw it there, but I don't think any American city has gone through this much rapid flux in our time as Seattle is right now, and it's really bewildering.
It is, and I think there is a sense to fetishize the nostalgia of old places. Like, I don't know if you guys remember the Frontier Room. So I wrote a poem about that, and I mean, really, it was a heroin-infested, urine in the sawdust on the floor kind of place, which if you were to go into it now, you'd be like, wow, this is disgusting. But somehow in our minds, we burnish it into a jewel, and the jewels form our grudge against change, right? And so I think there's so much of a imaginary component to this. And the narrative, there are two narratives that I'm trying to resist and question in this book. One is the gentrification narrative of, well, you could tell that, Cary.
So that's one of those words that's sort of a lightning rod because it means so much. It has so much depth for people, so much kind of a personal feeling as well as a political feeling. And I really try to remind myself and everyone that what we see when we say the word gentrification is the end result of a much larger dynamic. That this idea that people with more money can come in and buy a property and build something new is the end of the process. And the beginning of the process was the devaluation of that property in the first place. So in our city in Seattle, we redlined the Central District and a lot of the neighborhoods in South Seattle. We disinvested in those neighborhoods by not investing in schools, not investing in parks, not putting civic institutions there. We created a two-tier system, a two-class system, where the poor people had less than, and thereby their properties were worth less. And then when growth happened to such a point in the areas where the wealthy people lived, then they were looking around for, where can we go next? And this is what capitalism does. It needs to keep consuming and to keep destroying and renewing, because you have to keep investing wealthy people have to keep investing. They don't want to just let their money sit stagnant. And so gentrification is part of there's two parts to the dynamic, and the devaluation of property came first. It was intentional. It happens through elite power, through capital power, through the power of money. And then when you see a new building being developed, it is the second step in the process. And so I want to make sure we remember that, because we are all part of this neoliberal system where capital basically gets to define what happens in our city. And if we are fighting against the building that changed or against the developer that changed the building, we're putting, I don't know the right metaphor, maybe you can come up with a metaphor for me, but we're not fighting the right battle. We need to go much deeper and farther upstream and talk about who has power in this city and who has control over excess capital, surplus capital. How are we investing in the city? Is it public investment, developed through democracy towards the public interest, or is it developer power? Is it developer money? Is it money that is being used to create more wealth for the already wealthy? And I think we have to have a much deeper conversation in our city about who has power and how we are developing the city and who has a right to develop this city and who is it for? Because I think we're sort of missing the deeper question.
For sure. And here's the artist version. Nobody cared about that neighborhood. That's where I got my studio for $200 a month, and I could do anything I wanted. And then I made it nice, and they came in and took it away. That's the artist version. It runs a little shallow here in Seattle. That's my opinion. That the artist is perceives him or herself as the person who saved a space that no one else had an eye on and made it beautiful. And if you follow the kind of Richard Florida style argument that, that this is a component of investing, that the artists make it ready, and then the investor comes in and takes it away, and then the artist is displaced. That's how the narrative goes, I think, right now in the city, but without the bookending parts, which is who was there before the artist was there. Well, typically people of color and poor people and, abandoned places. And then the other end of it is that artists are displaced, yes, but it's part of a lot of people being displaced. So I wanted to kind of shine my flashlight on that unpopular notion that artists are not the saviors of the neighborhood who are the most deprived, but in fact part of a larger system of chain reactions. And maybe I'll get in a little trouble for that, I don't know. But the other thing that I was just eager to kind of disrupt that narrative a little bit and say, wow, there are also nooks and crannies still happening in the city. And I resist the idea of those being papered over with the idea that all the artists and all the good things in town are being run out. I think what's happening is that narrative is being kind of, it's running the show right now instead of why don't we get to know the nooks and crannies and the artists who are doing amazing work here, right? In the mid-90s when Benaroya and the Opera House were built, everybody thought it was a nightmare. Oh my God, they're gonna make this city world class. It's no. It's bring back the cultural dustbin. We need to go back to 1941 when Charles Beecham came here, the conductor, and threw a fit because a photographer was taking his picture and he said this place is a cultural dustbin. And we nurtured and cherished that image for the next 60 years. And it's, I'm really interested in how can we give some exposure and acknowledgement to the artists who are doing amazing things and not let that be papered over with everyone's leaving. It's tragic. There's amazing stuff going on. Anyway.
True, and I think we're lucky, we're blessed to have an amazing cultural landscape with so many organizations like Hugo House, and there's hundreds that are here because they care about cultural space, they care about art, they care about making things, they care about the dynamic between artists and culture and development, and artists playing an important role not as entertainers for the elite, but as creators of our culture, as critics of our culture, as the people who reflect back who we are and point out when we're falling short and imagine and invent new, better futures. I think there's a lot of respect and appreciation and support for the arts here that does work, and I don't want to lose sight of that. But I think we also have to be really careful about who gets to live here, because really,
absolutely.
displacement is really happening, and people of color, working class people, poor people of all varieties are the ones who are hit first and hardest, and they have already been dispersed, and there are a lot of people whose communities have been blown apart, that, what used to feel like a community that allowed, people to take care of one another, that provided a safety net, those communities have already been destroyed. Those networks have already been destroyed. So we're already in midway through displacement, and I think we have to take that really seriously, that we could become a city, a playground for the rich, a place where people use our arts, they use the beautiful landscape, they use the beautiful cultural landscape and activity here for entertainment, instead of really valuing everyone as a citizen contributing to creating this place. And there's a big difference. And you can go to parts of Manhattan and be horrified, and you can go to parts of San Francisco and be horrified because they didn't stop it before it just sort of became a shell of itself.
What do you think the traits are of a city that's been so gentrified it's kind of gone over the edge?
Venice. Has anybody been to Venice recently? It's appalling. It's like the number of people who actually live there is now hovering like 10 to 20%. I don't remember the number, but it is all second homes for wealthy people and all cruise ships, and the whole city is now sort of a entertainment district, play acting at what they used to really be. And it's so tragic to see it. Like it can happen.
I sort of think of San Francisco as someone's lowered a glass dome over it. And because of the geographical confines with the water, space is so limited that so few people have access into and out of the dome. And it's just this high-tech fog of money and, I don't know, art that's just fading. I mean, it just seems so sad to me.
Yeah, it's like a Disneyland version of a city.
So how do you face all this in a hopeful way? Like, what do you think the way is to coax the arts out of the gentrification model that we're going through? How do you save it?
I think Seattle's ready for a revolution. There are so many people here who I think would reject I hate to keep using the word neoliberal, but reject this idea of supply side, trickle-down economics where capital will organize everything, just be patient, the market will sort this out and everybody will be fine. There's so many people who reject that ideology, who see what it's done when they walk in our city and see the homelessness crisis, and they say, that's not us. Like, that is not the place we want our city to be. Why is it like that? And people are ready for a new answer. They're ready to reject what has not worked. And I think artists have an incredibly important role to play in that there's posters, always great pace posters going up, but that one, sweep streets, not lives, I think that's what it says. It's just so powerful. I mean, there's so many artists who are saying really important things about what is wrong with our system now and what we need to have instead in a creative, provocative, demanding way. So I think, artists are often the forefront of the revolution, and I hope we can continue to like keep enough artists in this town where that can actually happen, because I think we need to organize our energy together. I think we're all frustrated in our own silos, but how are we going to come together and know what are the right answers? I mean, there's some great models, great organizations, great advocacy efforts that are in motion now, so it's not like nothing's happening, but I think we need artists to keep fueling that and keep pushing and keep showing the way.
Yeah, that's a great point. I have a friend who's emblematic of kind of what's going on in the arts. I think her name's Lori Goldston. She's a cellist, and she may be one of the great experimental, classically detrained cellists in the world. I mean, she's super popular in other cities, and here in Seattle, she's kind of hidden. And she said the one thing that might save her ilk people who are doing their own work. They're not really compromising to fit kind of a larger, glossy landscape. She said that the new Seattle is craving authenticity. And even if it's like packaged and sold in some way, that craving of authenticity of the Laurie Goldston playing in an old building and doing beautiful recordings, people are starting to crave that. So I don't know if any of you have been to a place called Woodland Theater. It's on kind of where Ballard meets Finney Ridge in the flats down there. And if you go in that place, it is the model, I think, of where the arts could be headed here in some ways. Here's what it looks like. You go in and there's a young man who has set up a CD shop. So he has all these really esoteric CDs from all over the world, and he's written a review for every CD in the shop, handwritten. So you look at them and then if you ask him a question, he'll find you a CD. And then you go further in, and there's kind of like a rundown theater that has maybe that selection of seats over there. And the shows that are going on there are the most popping experimental things that you can imagine. And then there are offices for people like Laurie Goldston who are teaching students and tending to their affairs, as she puts it. And there's something about that space that when you walk in there, you think anything is possible. You know, like that this exists right now among all the new and the shiny, this one little place down there. And there's another place in Pioneer Square called Project Analog that is doing a similar thing. And I think it's up to us to frequent those places, to nurture them, to talk about them in our despair for what's being erased, and sort of lift them up a bit and create a different cultural dialogue other than the one, everything is lost. I don't know. Is that that's too woo-woo, isn't it?
It's charming, but I feel like...
It's charming, but ill-informed, really.
It's important to celebrate those things and to know them and support them.
Yeah.
But I think we also have to recognize, we all feel powerless.
Yeah.
And that reclaiming power is the key to prevent what happened in San Francisco.
Okay, so is it like that every developer must provide 2 apartments for artists? How do you get this on the ground?
Okay, now we're talking the stuff I like to talk about.
I know, she's like that.
I think, it's a matter of who has a seat at the table, I think, is essential, because we've been in this mode for so long of wealthy, white, well-meaning elites saying, oh, we know what needs to happen. We're skilled. We have the degrees. We went to the Ivy League schools. We know people. We can make the right thing happen. And that's what got us into this mess. So first we have to change that, who has a seat at the table. And then we have to talk about, yes, and all the different solutions. Yes, we need backyard cottages. We need to get rid of single-family zoning and have residential zoning. And if you want to have a backyard cottage, we need to make it easy for you to put in a backyard cottage. We need to keep going with upzoning because we do need to create more space. We need to take all the cultural districts that we have now and think about how to make sure they stay affordable to artists. And those are places like Pike Place Market and Pioneer Square and the Pike Pine Corridor and Ballard and Columbia City and Georgetown. There's all these places that still have art, that still have this mix, this dynamic mix of people creating things and cool coffee shops and cool retail and neighbors coming together. So know that those are essential and important and protect them. And so yes, in those places when new buildings come in, definitely require that there be production, performance space, and or spaces for artists and affordable housing. I think the city has to take a much stronger role in guiding how to create space for artists and for art and for basically all low-income people, all people who work in working-class jobs or creative jobs, because if not, the natural market will push them all out of our city. And so the city has to guide this, and we have to all demand the city guide this, and also welcome it in our own neighborhoods, and let go of this idea of My house is my investment. My house is where I preserve my wealth for my children, and think collectively about how do we create a community? How do we create a healthy society where everybody's welcome, where everybody gets to stay here? Because that's what we all love about Seattle. That's what brought us all here in the first place.
So that change in behavior and thinking about, a sense of place as a kind of a vessel for wealth, how do you change that on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis? Like, are there practices when you were out touring the city and hearing stories? Were there places that were doing that really well?
I bumped into a few places that kind of were really inspiring. I think there are great people in Beacon Hill who understand the fragility of their neighborhood and the importance of community and all income levels being together and having a mix of people from different races and classes that have always been there in that neighborhood who get it and are trying, working really hard to protect it. And I think having El Centro de la Raza there as a model for that kind of development, where you have civic space, cultural space, creative space, affordable housing, and retail, that's all part of this same idea of community, is the best model that we have so far in Seattle. So, and I think even going way up north, all the way in the northeast corner of the city, the neglected area up there that's now become incredibly diverse, a lot of people from other races and classes besides white people who have traditionally been there are moving there, and they've figured out ways to build community together. And in their, being neglected by the city, they've taken a lot of ownership themselves and have really cool visions for how they want to develop and how they want to create community together. So there are really good examples throughout the city, some with the city's help, but mostly started by community, and eventually the city caught up and said, oh, that's something good, maybe we can afford to support that.
Yeah. What advice would you give Paul Allen about 23rd and Jackson?
So that's a fascinating story, because there's a group of artists, Artist Coalition for Equitable Development, look them up, they are doing great work, basically pushing back at Paul Allen and saying, Paul Allen, you love the arts, you believe Seattle is a creative city, it's essential to your, what you're trying to do, you need to work with us and make sure that you are building place for us in your new development. Don't gentrify us out. And they're giving him very specific requests and advice about, here's how to do this. We need to be equity partners by having a community land trust as part of this, so we build ownership in your project over time. We need space for affordable housing for people from this community. We need a grocery store with food that we can afford that is not for the gentrifiers. We need production space and space for artists, and we want to be at the table developing the vision with you. And it's a really good model, and I'm trying to help them and support their work because it's the right way to approach it.
So in the beginning you said that you Oh, I'm sorry. Whoa. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah. So in the beginning, Cary, you were talking about being a fan of growth and development. Are you seeing places in Seattle that you're happy about, seeing new buildings and the shiny and the new? Does any of it make you happy?
Individual buildings make me happy. I think the development has come so fast. I can't think of one neighborhood where I can say the whole neighborhood's doing great.
Yeah.
I think Pioneer Square did a really good job of increasing their heights, but not too far. So they're building a few new buildings, but nothing's being torn down. There's no redevelopment pressure. It's all developing the empty lots or the abandoned buildings that were falling apart. So I think they found the right mix. And of course, Pike Place Market, I think, is always on their game, always doing the right thing. But that's not really practical for every neighborhood. You can't run every neighborhood the way you run Pike Place Market.
Yeah, I get that. So I have this kind of thing going at cross purposes all the time where I see, do you guys know what facades are? Yeah, facades are where you keep the front of a building and then you insert a plastic skyscraper within it. The old Bauhaus? Is that in the old Mud Bay, all in along Pine Street there? So, there's something kind of cool about keeping the facade, but then it becomes this artifice to sort of shield you from the horror that ensues, right? And In this book, I'm using that facsotomy image to go all the way back to what I call a timber curtain, which is the name I give to the line of trees that logging companies leave in front of a clear cut. Right? So it's this line of trees that may be there to console you. Like, oh, it's not so bad as the clear cut behind it, right? And then when you drive by in the car, it's like flash, 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 and you're like, whoa, I see through that. So I have that same feeling in the city about facsotomies, and yet, how nice that they left something to console us with. Do you see what I mean? It's like, already I'm into the metaphor that's both a problem and a weird sort of half-assed solution. And that's kind of the world I'm interested in exploring in this book. And so the way that shows up in here is I literally black out parts of poems. So you'll read the poem and then later in the book it'll come back, but half of it'll be blacked out like a redacted FBI document. So the poem that's left is the residue of what was originally there. And I'm interested in finding beauty in that and not just horror. Does that make sense? So as a poet, aesthetically, that's kind of what I'm trying to do. And thanks to Chin Music, Bruce, the amazing angelic publisher, let me actually build a facsotomy in the book where there's a fold-out page of a scooped-out poem and a new poem jammed in. So when you pull the page out, you can see the whole splendorific horror of the thing. And so I guess I'm kind of like you're thinking, Cary, like there are all these integrated ways of looking at it, like building by building. You're like, oh, that's beautiful, or nice try with a facade, and then you just keep hoping that there's some kind of nook and cranny where someone can live for under $3,000 a month. And I just don't know. What do you think?
I love the way you did that with the poems in the book. It was, I don't know if you've read the book yet, but it was just so fascinating that you read one poem, and then you see the blocked out images, and then you read the words that are left that created a whole different poem. Mm-hmm. And it is fascinating because your brain thinks it remembers something from the previous poem, but really you're enjoying the new poem now. And that analogy for how we experience the city is really fascinating, and you're going to like the book if you haven't read it yet.
Oh, thank you.
But I think with what we were asking about the city, I think, if you look at the great big cities of the world, and so many of them are 200, 300, 400 years old, and they all have layers of history, layers and layers and layers. And I think that's one thing we miss as it being a new city. We're 150 years old, that we forget that cities are additive and that you don't have to preserve things in amber and say, that was good and this is bad. But you can keep the things you love and keep protecting and preserving pieces and keep adding new pieces, and it's going to be okay. And I think, one thing the historic preservation group and the Historic Seattle do really well is finding the right buildings that are really worth preserving. And I think one thing we often don't do well in Seattle is in Pioneer Square, I'll pick on them now, is that all the new buildings have to somehow mimic the old buildings. And I think we need to be okay with the new buildings can look different. They can have a dialogue with the old buildings. They can say something completely different that is resonant, but not have to copy the old buildings. And I think we need to get more mature to understand that eventually those buildings will be old and there'll be a whole new layer that we can keep adding. And we have to have a longer view of what, the assemblage of the city physically is. But I also want to keep going back to, it's not just what it looks like, it's how it works too. And who gets to be here? How much does it cost to live here? Who gets to afford to live in the cool new apartments? And I think if we focus on what things look like, we're forgetting that for a city to work, we all have to feel we belong, we have a right, and we can shape what this future is.
Mm-hmm. And for me, I think with the new Hugo House coming in, which is going to be beautiful, to me it's like buying a cast iron skillet that hasn't been seasoned yet. And it's going to need a whole lot of things to happen in the place to build up seasoning. Like architects can do incredibly beckoning gestures in 3 dimensions, but they can't make up for the fact that, the people who've run into each other at Hugo House or met each other there, or, some writer throwing a fit or someone throwing a drink on the floor, all that stuff needs to happen again with new people so that we get some seasoning in the skillet. And then things won't seem so kind of hygienic, maybe.
Do you have any ideas on what are the active ingredients to make Hugo House 2.0 or any cultural space work?
Well, yeah, I mean, I left the directorship of Hugo House like 10 years ago, so this is like just from afar, but when I was putting it together, I realized that there were certain criteria that I pulled actually from Richard Hugo that I thought would make it a viable cultural space. One is that it would be a triggering town, which means that really good things would happen there and people would imagine things that could happen there, and that the crossroads of it would welcome strangers. So in other words, like if I go into a space and I see, the anti-loitering, anti-homeless signs up, it totally freaks me out because it seems like a values clash to me. Like you have to sort of set up and welcome the stranger no matter how disheveled or, messed up the person is. And that's the really hard work, is to figure out how to welcome people and keep people safe. So it's not protecting the structure of the space all the time if you're sacrificing that welcoming the stranger. That's the hardest thing about doing a cultural organization, is to constantly be open, 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 and deal with the ramifications of what that means. I also think that cultural spaces start to have inside jokes and little stories that they retell. Like you can really tell a place by how people talk about it. Like there was the burning toast smell in the stairway of the old Hugo House, or there was the dead girl in the basement, ghost. And the way people talk about it, is like so invigorating because it had its own language. And I think that's super important too. The other thing, I'm just going to say this, it's a little out of context. It might be a little bit of a bump in the conversation. But the other thing about cultural spaces that I've been noticing lately is that artists are not getting paid. Okay, this is a thing. So when you guys go to something, or when someone says, hey, do you know someone who, like a painter who can like show up and show their art, or can you ask the question like, well, is it going to be for sale? Is it going to be like, what's going to reimburse the artist who's doing that work? And so that's a really challenging thing too in our city. As everything grows and gets more glamorous and glittery, everybody's starstruck with how things look and the infrastructure of it all. But you know who's not getting paid? The artists. The artists are not getting paid, you guys. And so that's a cultural trait, I think, that's really important as organizations develop, that you don't get new carpet so you can pay an artist. And that's a scruffy old Seattle value. That's a very scruffy old Seattle value. And so that's something that is very equity oriented that I feel really strongly about. I mean, I had an email today asking if I knew someone who could write about this event. And I said, how much do you pay? And they said, oh, we don't. And I was like, sorry. Like what, I'm going to call someone and say, can you come here and write about me? And then, oh, by the way, you're not getting paid? Do you know what I'm saying? Anyway, so that's where my equity buttons really get pushed. Infrastructure, glitter, pay the people who are doing the work.
And that makes me think of two things. One, we both have kids about the same age, and I think a big motivation for my work as an activist is just looking at the condition of the world we are leaving to the next generation. And it's appalling. It makes me so angry and ashamed that things like that happen, that we are using the next generation to just extract from instead of investing in them. And, I told this story a lot in the campaign, but when I graduated from college in 1985 with no student debt because I went to a state school and it was practically free, Of course I could find an apartment. Of course I could find a job that would train me and pay me while they trained me. Like, the way the world worked when we were young is we have taken away every single one of those things from the next generation. And when I look at our kids, it's so maddening, because they deserve to have the same a good start, a good launch into life that we had. And why do we think it's okay to treat them so cruelly and push them out and say, sorry, you're not going to get paid, just do it for exposure, or sorry, you can't afford to live here, maybe you can have 8 people in a 3-bedroom apartment, or sorry, you can't have health insurance, and sorry, we're not going to train you at your job. And there's just everything we're offering young people is cruel and greedy. And as a baby boomer / Gen Xer, I am so ready to be on their side of the revolution, because our generation messed things up for them, and we need to be part of fixing it.
Okay, I have an idea. Do you want to hear it?
Yes.
Okay. What if all the arts and cultural organizations in Seattle got together and agreed to a union-style compensation program for people who worked for them? Have you guys ever seen what people at museums make with how much money they make? If you want to have a good weep on some cold Sunday afternoon, just take a look at what people at museums make. Entry level, the kids who are working reception desks. Did you guys know that there's a whole hidden affluence that's going on of kids who can afford to take internships and be unpaid or paid below the minimum wage or about minimum wage at arts organizations, because that's what arts organizations are saying they can afford? And so we're training the next generation of affluent kids to become leaders in the arts. Is this a good idea? No. So, I think one of the things Seattle could do with its incredible affluence is to have arts and culture organizations sit down and say, you know what, everyone who comes through these doors who works here is going to make $20 an hour. Done. Is that, have you guys seen this? Do you know what I'm talking about? You can get an internship. Oh, really? An internship? You're going to be our receptionist for free for a year? Right on, come on over. Okay, just saying. So that's where I hold Cary's flame of righteous anger. In the glittery infrastructure, what the hell is going on with wages?
How are you going to fund it?
Good idea. Yeah, I guess the same way you fund new carpets and new paint and nice stuff. And yeah, I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. But there is a whole exploitation thing that's going on within beautiful buildings. Sorry, folks, bummer, huh? So what else, Cary? Anything else you want to?
I don't know. I guess I'm curious about how you see poetry and arts provoking, pushing, inviting us to imagine a better future. Because I read one of your lines, or it was I think in the film even, this is Seattle, a place to love whatever's left. And being the earnest, just formerly out of my campaign politician mode, everything I say is earnest. I am completely humorless at this moment because I can't remember how to make jokes. So when I read that, I took it seriously, and then I realized, okay, no, you're being ironic. But tell me what is the role of, what is the best role of artists in pushing to create the city that we know we deserve, that we know we want, in being part of that conversation, and also holding leaders accountable?
Wow, I think the really exciting work where poetry is pushing social change is actually happening in spoken word and hip hop. So I'm just an old white lady writing on the page. So I feel like I can do things like make physical metaphors of what I see going on in the city. And this book has an introduction about what we're seeing in Seattle. But it's really hard. We don't have sort of that earmark of poets and writers being visible as social change agents here. in the way maybe some other artists are more visible. I think we're not. So I don't know. I guess poets are the legislators of truth and the future. I mean, it's the old Yeatsian model where you take poetry into politics and you keep referring to, back to poems as the ideal. Poets are also the mischief makers, the fools, the people who can say the unexpected thing because we have this breathless urge for novelty. And so we'll just say anything to see how it sounds and to see, the juxtapositions of language. But boy, I'm way up in the sphere. My day job is teaching young people, I think, to appreciate writing their own stuff and reading. I mean, wow, reading, there's something. I actually am having my students now time how long they can read without checking their phones. And we're trying to, as whole classes, like go from 7 to 12 to 20 to a whole hour of doing that. So boy, I guess in the quietest little art, I'm pushing as hard as I can, but I wish I had other answers for you.
Yeah, I think it's, it used to be easy to be poor in Seattle. I mean, you could find a cheap apartment, you could work a working class job or a restaurant job or a creative job, and there were always cheap diners, there was always the cheap bar, there was always, rice and beans at the grocery. It wasn't that hard to live poor here. And I think that because that's not very possible anymore, because, everything is so expensive, the cost of living is so high here, I think we've pushed out so many artists and culture makers and creative folks. It's that there's no critical mass. I think the role of artists to, be the vanguard of the revolution, like we saw in the 60s, it's less and less possible now in a city that's so expensive. So I think we have to find a new way to organize folks that's not based on physical proximity, but that's based on, just use whatever tools we have to connect folks and build this sense of inventing the future together without meeting in public, without meeting face to face, I mean.
That's great. That's great. Should we open it to questions? What do you think?
Okay.
All right.
Yeah, I think we have some time for questions. Actually, if folks don't mind, it's possible to come up to the microphone so we can all, there we go, so we can all hear you in the room and
That's
pick you up for
great.
the archival
I love
recording.
understanding.
I just want to say I'm all in for the artist cultural worker union, the cross sector union, but we can talk
Wouldn't
about that at some other time.
It'd be brave,
Yeah.
wouldn't it? Lead it, Edward.
But if we have a question over here, please.
Talking about agents of change, and poets and artists can be agents of change. In Seattle and in much of the modern goings-on, it seems like the technicians, the people that work at Amazon and Microsoft, that class seems to be the agent of change. How do the poets, the more free thinkers, maybe compete with these more concrete, bring about an obvious, real change that everybody can live with and appreciate?
I think they need to hang out more, and integrate more in a salon-like environment. So I used to hang out at the Frontier Room, right? And all the, out-of-work timber guys were pissed that the artists were coming in. Now the artists got pissed that the engineers were coming in. It's just a lot of kind of horizontal anxiety and hatred, but really I think a lot of the tech folks really want to touch that sense of the arts, and their lives are busy and packed, and they're working hard and making long commutes. And so I don't know how structurally to make that happen, but it's a great point. What do you think, Cary?
I think there's a few really cool efforts that have come together, like the Housing for All campaign that's sort of centered in the Transit Writers Union, but they've invited, I think, 15 or 20 different organizations that are social justice organizations, transit organizations, housing organizations, and neighborhood organizations to come together. And they have a pretty simple set of goals that are pretty easy to buy into, and that they're building this cross race, cross class, cross everything coalition to achieve goals. And I think those kind of efforts are essential for that kind of, bringing people together. So you have to name a fairly simple goal that everybody can get behind, and then grow that and build trust, build relationships, because we've become so siloed, and it's so hard to get out of your, professional sphere or your neighborhood and remember what it's like to talk to people who are nothing like you. And, it's harder and harder to do that, so we have to, build these efforts that intentionally bring people together.
I know, I think we should put an artist on every connector bus and not tell anyone else on the bus that there was an artist on board. Just that there was one, but they didn't know who it was. So they're trying to figure it out all the time and then get it completely funded. Ideas are born.
So at the beginning, you were talking about the Woodland Park Theater, the Woodland Theater, that was formerly the Josephine. And I know that somewhere in its history, it was a ski slope trainee facility.
Wow, I'm learning.
So that block is one of those things that I think is a little unique to Seattle, where we have buried within the different neighborhoods little pockets of bars, shoe repair shops, maybe a grocery store. And we agree that's a unique situation with that theater. How in the world, I know that you just said, we can't actually protect that theater. That theater's gonna get torn down. Every single story business that we like to drink in or meet with our friends in is basically has a bullseye on it in this town. But you use that specifically. So how do we save that theater?
I don't know that theater. Frances brought it up.
Okay,
so what neighborhood is it in?
For your purposes here, it's on 65th Street. It's right at, 8th and 65th Street?
Yeah, and you're using it as a metaphoric stand-in for how do we save these small places that are the nooks and crannies.
This is a little bit bigger because it's a theater. It's got it's got the record store in it, right? Yeah. Is anything worth saving?
Well, when Dick's goes, I'm out of here.
That's sort of my question, is can we save anything?
I don't know, what do you think?
I know it's just a space. I know it's just a space, right? Historically, that's the other thing about Seattle. It's from an East Coast perspective, when you're looking at things that are gonna make the line for historic preservation, it's it's not the East Coast line. You have to be able to maybe make the line, the bar a little bit lower for Seattle because you don't have buildings that are 200 years old. You know what I mean? Sometimes it is just, you want to save it because it's a really cool looking X auto dealership.
There's a really good effort in the city that is about protecting, preserving cultural spaces. And it's within the Office of Arts and Culture. I forgot exactly what the project's name, but they came out with a plan of these places are essential to our creative life, our cultural life, and we have to figure out how to protect them. So we don't erase all of them because they often tend to be cheap buildings that are easy for somebody to buy and tear down. And so they have an amazing list of here's how to do it. And of course, they need 10 times as much money as they've been allocated, but there is a plan and there is a good intention. And I think, what we need is to figure out how to get it funded. And like all good things in the city that we know should happen, they don't have enough funding.
The developers.
But I think the city, if the city can take a stronger role, if we as citizenry can say to the city, we want you to do a better job providing affordable housing, protecting these spaces, all the list of things we want, we also have to say, and we're willing to pay for it. We are willing to tax ourselves, to raise our taxes, so you have enough money to invest in these things that are essential to our city and essential to our cultural life. And I think that's perfectly possible to do it, and I think it's time in our city. I think we are so sick of not having power. We're so mad and frustrated and heartbroken at what we're doing to the least among us, the people who've been displaced and made homeless and pushed out. We are ready for the pendulum to swing back in this city. I believe that.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Question over here.
We're all familiar with the success that the Percent for Art has had excuse me, on art, and I was simply going to suggest a percent for payment to artists, payment that would be required from all the businesses, whomever would be hiring the artists, that there would be 1% that they had to dedicate to the artists. Just a thought.
That's great.
That's cool. Like, yeah, and all nonprofit donations, all foundation donations to nonprofit can carve out 1% to pay artists. I like that.
Yeah.
All right, we're talking about saving spaces from neoliberal capital, but we actually own half the city in terms of the public parks and streets. There was a great exhibit at the space over King Street Station a few years ago where they asked artists to envision how they would change Seattle. And I'd like to ask both of you what you would do if you could change our public spaces to benefit the arts.
To benefit what?
The arts.
The arts.
You have to take that one, Cary.
That's a good question. I think the making sure that we have space for rehearsal and performance of all the arts is essential, and can we use civic spaces and public spaces somehow for that, I think is a question worth asking. I think that, in the summer, the city pays performers to be in public parks, in downtown at least, and I think we could do that throughout the whole city, wherever there's critical mass of folks on weekends in public parks. So I think that's a really good thing to explore, because that we are a city that has attracted such an amazing, array of culture makers, from Nirvana to the great painters at UW to hip-hop musicians. I mean, there's just, it goes on, and people come here because there is a creative culture, and people come here because it's so inspiring, the big nature, big industry, big landscape, the magic of this place. And so, like, the city, that used to happen naturally when it was cheap, and it used to work organically. And now that it doesn't anymore, I think the city, has to really invest in making those things happen. So it's a really good question, and we have to keep all thinking about the answer together. And we do have an Office of Arts and Culture, and we did invent Percent for Art here. And so I think we have this commitment. We just need to invest in the next level and double down.
And I think we need a stronger media here that is promoting and spotlighting the arts more. People are really trying, but I think we're down to 1 or 2 visual art critics in the city, and that's rough. So I oddly would invest in printed and social media matter and try to raise the profile of what's happening here.
Hi, you're gonna have to forgive me. There's not gonna be a question mark at the end of this. I've been trying to think of a way to phrase it.
Just lift your voice at the end of the sentence.
There you go, exactly. But something that you said about people craving authenticity really struck me, and I sort of thought about it in a different way, and thinking about these new shiny buildings, and we need the residential space, we need the housing, but I find that a lot of the buildings that are going up are just pretty boring to me. There's nothing new in them. They feel plastic, and when we think about that, that additive nature of cities and adding things and creating layers, I just sort of wonder about what's this layer that we're leaving for the next round of buildings, and also when we're thinking about that authenticity and arts, but what your thoughts are in terms of the buildings themselves, the architecture and the art within architecture.
I think there's some exciting new buildings going up. I think Ed Weinstein did a really good job with the new Hugo House building. Now just bear with me for a minute. It looks like a giant edifice that it's like, at first you're gonna be like, really? But it's really carefully done with very long-lasting materials. It's a good eco design, And Hugo House is going to be in the first floor of that new building, and then there'll be apartments above. The second thing I want to say about that is that that's actually a really good benevolent gentrification story. The owners of that property bought it in 1998 for $875,000. It's rumored they were offered $15 million for it, and they said no. And they said, we want the arts to stay on Capitol Hill, we're going to keep Hugo House on the same patch of earth, and we're going to develop it ourselves. And we're going to put apartments above it, and we're going to rent them out, and we're going to recoup our losses that way. But we're going to keep Hugo House on that same patch of land. We need 1,000 people to do the same thing. That was Cary's idea. 1,000 people with that kind of money to make those kinds of long-term decisions that aren't just taking the, 14 million and walking away, right?
And I'll also add that, we have a very, very rigid and prescriptive building code, design review process, and in some ways it's useful because it prevents terrible things from being built, but it also prevents great things from being built. So we have to figure out a way to focus on great materials because they weather better, they last better, they're more tactile, they're more touchable, and so that's one part of it. Allowing innovation. We used to innovate a lot with building techniques and materials, but now Vancouver and Portland have gone way ahead of us in their use of timber and other innovations in building, and so we need to incentivize innovation again because that can be inspiring and invent new ways to doing things that fit with our neighborhoods and our climate. And I think also for the low-cost buildings that, design review process is trying so hard to make them not ugly, I think we need to kind of rethink how to do that, because what we end up doing is making them all not ugly in the same way, and then they all become ugly together. So we need to figure out a way to loosen that up in some ways and tighten that up in other ways.
I'll make a comment before my question. I've lived in a number of other places and just moved back to Seattle recently, and I just have to say that I'm astounded in a good way that someone who says some of the things like Cary has been saying tonight was a close runner-up in the mayoral election. I mean,
thank you.
Seattle has a lot of reasons to be hopeful, I think.
I just want to, can I clap for that for a second?
But my question is actually completely different. Most of the examples that you guys gave from Benaroya Hall down to the wheat pastes and the graffiti are examples of art that is performed publicly and consumed very publicly also, or at least en masse. Whereas poetry is something that's composed in private and most often consumed in private also, I would say. And so I guess what I'm struggling with is the link between the intimate art of poetry and this public flourishing of the arts that we seem to in general be celebrating tonight that leads to these healthy, diverse neighborhoods and everything. So I don't know, is there a link there? How do we reconcile those two things? What is it about books, literacy, education in general that maybe connects those?
Well, back, 30 or 40 years ago, there were only like 6 poets here, right? And they were either at Red Sky or at the university. And then, if you can imagine, like the more academic poets, like the David Wagner crowd, and then you had the Red Sky poets like Jesse Bernstein. And never those two camps would meet, right? And now there are so many poets and so many publishing venues and so many little bookstores and places to go and read your work and so many of those things going on that I'm kind of taking solace in the fact that it's a sea of possibility out there, that so many people are engaged in the quiet art and it's turning up, all over. So I guess that's a good thing. And Seattle always struggles with having like sort of an emblematic civic poet, and it's always like a big scramble and there's a million people running and people are arguing, and I think that's super healthy. So I think it does turn up, and just the range of material I see is just astonishing. So I'm sort of taking solace in that.
I actually think that's a really nice moment. Cary, do you have?
I was going to say, you can only love what you can see. And I think the more we understand poets and artists and musicians and makers of all things as essential to our community, and the more we see where they work and see their work and participate in their work, the more we feel community and the more we feel like it's our job to protect creative culture, and because it's an essential part of being a city and growing and changing.